In 1066, William the Conqueror and his fleet set off from here on the coast of Normandy. It was a remarkably well-timed trip that way, across the English Channel. The riches of England lay just over the horizon, and it was a land that would turn this Norman duke into a king. English history was about to change forever.
The Normans were coming, and nothing would be the same again. But who were William and his band of rugged warriors? Who were the Normans, and what made them so good at conquering? How did heathen Viking raiders, Northmen, turn into Christian Norman rulers and adventurers, spreading across the globe?
Soon, there was not a part of medieval Europe or even the Middle East that didn't feel the impact of their presence.
In this series, I'm exploring how these Northmen made roots in Normandy and established a new type of society, and following the roots of conquest to find out what made the Normans uniquely successful 1,000 years ago.
We are here in Normandy to meet these all-conquering men and women of the North.
This part of northern France has always been a prosperous area. The Romans and later Germanic tribes were attracted by these riches. From the 5th century, this area then fell under Frankish control, culminating with the great European empire created by Charlemagne.
Look at this absolutely luscious Norman countryside. It's incredibly fertile, and it's not just a great place for crops, but it also grows the most important crop in the Middle Ages, sheep, who are covered in wool. In a world before indoor heating, sheep and their wool mean riches, and it keeps people warm. So not only is this a wonderful place for agriculture more generally, it's a great place to be a shepherd. This means wealth and power.
The Merovingian dynasty, which controlled the Frankish kingdom for centuries, took a shine to this fertile and connected area and its abundant resources. They called it Neustria, and established royal residences and monasteries across the land, including one of the most famous of them all.
The medieval pilgrims struggling their way across these windy tide flats were on their way to what they called St. Michael in Peril of the Sea. But today we know it better as the magnificent monastery of Mont Saint-Michel.
The Abbey of Saint-Michel, holding relics of the Archangel St. Michael, was established just off the Frankish coast in the 8th century. It soon flourished as a place of prayer and pilgrimage.
But this area had a problem. The same things that meant it was able to support religious life, well-connectedness, and wealth, meant it was also susceptible to attacks from the sea.
Sea-borne raiders from across northern Europe had plundered the region since Roman times. But in the late 8th century, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Now there was a new threat from Scandinavia, the people we call the Vikings. Through the 8th century, they increasingly came into contact with northern European kingdoms, trading and raiding. With their formidable longboats and surprise attacks by sea and river, the Vikings sailed far and wide in search of wealth and power. But the place where the Viking story had some of its most dramatic beginnings was northern France. The rich land, cities, and great rivers were a magnet for the Vikings.
So we are here in Rouen on the banks of the Seine. And from 790 onwards, this was essentially a highway for Vikings. Now, before this, the Vikings had already been raiding up and down the coast of the North Sea. But by 790, they set their sights on the Seine because this is an incredibly fertile and wealthy part of the world. So from 790, the locals essentially have to put up with summer being the Viking season. And yes, you've got a great farm, but at any moment, a band of warriors might come burn it down and enslave you. It's testament to the fact that this is an incredibly rich place to live, and it's worth putting up with this kind of terror.
From 841, the Viking raids intensified in Normandy. The town of Rouen was plundered and burned. The Vikings encroached further and further down the Seine, and in 845 they reached Paris. At the siege, Ragnar Lodbrok, the Viking hero, led the Northmen to plunder and occupy the city, withdrawing only after the Frankish king Charles the Bald paid a ransom, the first Danegeld tribute collected from the Franks.
By the mid-9th century, Viking incursions are just a facet of life in the lower Seine Valley. If you live here, you know that in the summer they're going to come. But by 851, something changes. Instead of returning to Scandinavia in the winter, the Vikings decide they're going to overwinter here. Suddenly, Vikings aren't something that you put up with in the summer. They're here to stay.
And it didn't help that the Franks were at war with themselves. Charles the Bald took the reins in the westernmost Frankish kingdom, but had to fight his own aristocrats as well as the Vikings. Northern France was there for the taking.
So this is an absolute delight. It's a replica Frankish village from around the time that the Northmen would have been showing up here, about the end of the 8th century. Of course, if Vikings showed up to pillage here, I think they'd be a little bit disappointed. The church that they would want to steal from is still under construction. But still, this is an excellent opportunity to see what things would have been like at that time, and I have got all dressed up for the occasion.
To really understand the remarkable success of the Vikings, we've got to examine their most precious weapon, the Viking Longboat.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That is just incredible.
Yeah, we are really proud of this one.
I can imagine.
We would like to row with it.
I'm meeting with Mehdi Safer, whose team at Park Ornevik constructed a longboat using the tools available to the Vikings.
So I think it's fair to say that the Viking longboat is really the most impressive piece of tech about these people. So how do you make an incredible ship like this?
First of all, I think the boat should be made with the keel, which is like a spine for the boat. After that, we will start to make stems. All the strength of those boats, it's what we call clinker built. It means that the first planks will be set on the keel and overlap each planks, which allow us to have a strength boat, and then it will be also very light. So it's the best way to make a Viking ship. After this, we also have a mast, which allow the Vikings to also make sail, which allows them to go very far, like America, or even further on the east until the Volga River.
So how difficult is it to make something like this? Could any Viking do it, or is this a very special skill?
No, it's very special skill. First of all, they will use oak trunks to make almost all parts of the hull. They will take the trunk and then they will just cleave the wood in some pieces, almost until 16 pieces. And from this, they will start to work only with very basic tools such as axes or broad axes. So everything will be handmade. So look at this plank here. And as you see, I could basically hold it with 2 of my fingers.
Wow.
So those planks were very, very light. But also, if you can take apart, you will see how flexible it is. That allows the boat to go along the waves.
Thank you. Oh, that's so cool. Sorry, I'm just freaking out.
Welcome on Longvin then.
You have no idea how much this means to me. This is an absolute dream come true.
Yeah, that's incredible to have such a boat.
I can't help noticing how small it is. You wouldn't have that many men in it necessarily, right?
In this one, we can go up to 12 or 15 men. But we had evidence of boats going up to 30, 35 meters long. And on these ones, you can go up to 70 men. And I think you wouldn't want 70 Vikings coming to your church.
How do we take, the different pieces of tech we've seen over there, flexible planks? What are the advantages?
First of all, the flexibility allows you to go through the waves, going along it, because it will be flexible. And the other thing, it's light. So when you come to a beach, you can drag it on the beach, or if you want to escape from Franks, you can just grab it and change river. It is a shallow hull boat. So Vikings will go where you don't expect them. These boats, it's really what gives the advantages to those Vikings.
I did the thing I always hate, and I immediately jumped to talking about the Vikings as just raiders and pillagers, but they're also so much more than that, right?
Much more than that. First of all, what we have here is what we call langskip. So these ones will be mostly for war or pillaging. But there are other types of boats. They had trade ships. After all, Vikings, before being pillagers, they are traders. So they are famous for fur trade, amber trade, ivory from the walrus trade, slave trades too. So sometimes they would maybe not even take these boats, but change boats along the way.
So it's almost like you do it as a relay. Stop, change boat again.
Exactly. So they went also to Baghdad. So they were traders and they would go everywhere.
So I guess what we can say about Vikings is just like the planks that make their boats. They are really flexible people.
Yes, exactly.
The Vikings' maritime superiority gave them the unique advantage of surprise. But the Northmen who came here were also masters at flexibility, at being able to take on characteristics of the culture they found. Moving on from the Frankish village, I'm exploring Park Ornevik's Viking village to see how local culture developed.
So you've got a whole Viking village here. Are all of these buildings based on archaeological finds from Normandy?
Not really. For example, this one is based on Swedish archaeological finds. In Normandy, we have almost no finds from our Vikings. Why? Well, because mostly they integrated well, they intermarry, they will adopt the local culture. As well, the Frankish culture would be like a soft power back then. It was the old empire of Charlemagne, so when they came here, they stopped to talk Norse. They started to learn the language, the culture.
So I suppose that the Frankish life is so good and the Vikings are so flexible, you're just going to have them integrate rather than try to impose a specific culture, yeah?
Yes, that's exactly what happened here.
As the Vikings encroached further into Neustria and began to overwinter here, monastic communities were increasingly terrorized. In 847 AD, they pillaged the original abbey at Mont Saint-Michel. Then, they turned their attention inland to the great religious houses along the Seine Valley, places like the great monastery at Fontenelle.
There was a reason that the Vikings were attracted to attacking monasteries specifically, and that's because they held incredible wealth. They also knew that the monks had taken vows of nonviolence, so if they were attacked, there was nothing that they could do. Further, because Vikings were pagan, they didn't really care about offending the Christian god by attacking his houses and stealing all his wealth. It was a recipe for disaster.
The monks of Fontenelle have left a remarkable record of the events in the 850s. No monastery was safe from the Viking attacks.
They laid waste all the monasteries and other places along the banks of the Seine, or else took large payments and left them thoroughly terrified.
Viking forces active in the region repeatedly passed within striking distance of Fontenelle on their way up and down the river. The monastic community here at Fontenelle would bear the brunt of several of these Viking attacks.
The first occurred in 851 in October, when the Vikings sacked it, stealing all of the treasure and terrorizing the monks. Not content, 89 days later, they returned. Finding that the monks were still gone, having taken all of the treasure they could carry as well as all of their relics, they were enraged. They burnt the monastery to the ground. This was so devastating that the community wouldn't be able to return until the 10th century.
The monks record their sense of terror as the Vikings destroyed their sacred home, even taking the holy relics of their patron saint.
Out of fear, and due to the oppression of these execrable heathens, the sacred bones and blessed ashes of the honorable confessor of Christ, Wandrille, having been disinterred from their tombs, were carried away from the monastery of Fontenelle.
Fontenelle is one of our best sources for information about what living with Viking raids was like. The annals of Fontenelle record in minute detail actual Viking incursions, which is a pretty big deal. Is the source biased? Well, yes, because it's written by the monks. But you'd be pretty biased if someone was coming and burning your house down too.
Viking attacks had created a huge crisis for Carolingian rulers. They justified their rule as representatives of God's authority on earth. So, a bunch of pagan warriors attacking their lands and harassing the clergy threw their authority into doubt. Weakened with internal divisions and with no permanent army, the Franks were forced to find a way to manage the unrelenting incursions of the Vikings. One remarkable Viking leader seized on this fragility. It led to an absolutely extraordinary event, right here in Rouen.
In 912, Rouen Cathedral was host to an incredible scene. Rollo, the local Viking leader, was baptized as a Christian. But it wasn't just Rollo. Hundreds of Viking retainers, his entire family, were all baptized at the same time.
Imagine the medieval cathedral full of Franks and Vikings mixing together. Pagan warriors queuing up to be baptized and taken into the Christian fold.
And this is a powerful symbol. It means that they mean to stay and integrate with the local area. They're not going to be fighting with the local French people anymore. As a part of this, Rollo also took a new name. He became Robert. He was named after his godfather, Robert II, who was the Marquis of Neustria. And again, this underscores the fact that they mean to be something entirely new. They're not just a bunch of Norse Vikings anymore. These are local people with a local religion, local names, and possibly new local customs.
Rollo, in taking on the name Robert and embracing the Christian church, became the first leader of Normandy. But how did this Viking leader and his band of marauding warriors get to this remarkable scene in Rouen Cathedral? He was already well known in the city, and not in a good way. Rollo's story began 36 years earlier when, as a pagan Viking, he besieged and took Rouen from the Franks.
Rollo is arguably one of the most important Normans to ever live, but paradoxically, we don't actually know that much about him until he comes here to Normandy. In the 11th century, people are saying that he was a Danish nobleman whose brother had got in trouble with the king and who fled here. A century later, people are saying that he was actually Norwegian and was a dignified nobleman who came here to conquer what he could. By the 13th century, the Icelandic saga of Snorri Sturluson says that he was Hrolf the Walker, a man so large that he couldn't ride a horse. Now, these are all light on actual facts, but what it shows us is that Rollo was an important enough person in the Middle Ages that if they didn't have facts, they were willing to make them up. This myth-making is as important to medieval people as any dates or names are to us.
Rollo's real-world adventures here began with violence. He took on the local ruler and besieged Rouen, virtually flattening it in the process. Hungry for more, Rollo took part in the siege of Paris in 885, and then captured Bayeux. Rollo was skilled with the usual Viking tools of violence and chaos, but he also cultivated the local nobility, and even married Papa, the daughter of a French noble. Her exact parentage is uncertain, and may have been invented to legitimize their son, William Longsword. Her rather sweet statue, made much later, still stands in Bayeux. Whatever Papa's real origins, by marrying her, Rollo was entering a powerful network of kinship. This would be the blueprint of Norman power. Conquest through terror and force, but then settlement, intermarriage, and adaptation to local society. Rollo continued to attack further and further down the Seine. He laid siege to Chartres in April 911. Eventually, after months of intense pressure on the city, the king, Charles the Simple, decided to counterattack and sent a coalition relief army to assist the besieged people of Chartres. The king's forces succeeded, and Rollo retreated back to Rouen. Rollo may have lost, but this was a major turning point in his fortunes. It showed that he was firmly entrenched in the heart of the kingdom, and Charles was tired of fighting. Compromise was necessary. Lengthy negotiations between Rollo and King Charles culminated with the famous Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte.
The treaty gave the Normans much more stability, but it also meant that they were now technically vassals of the French king. And that meant that they had to do homage. As a part of this, it meant that they were supposed to get on their knees and kiss the French king's feet. Legend has it that Rollo refused to do this, and instead sent one of his own vassals to do it in his stead. A second and more dramatic version of the story insists that Rollo pretended he was going to kneel down and instead toppled the king over backwards off of his chair. Now, these are legends, and there's probably no truth to them, but they exist because they tell us that the Normans were still incredibly proud. Yes, they were vassals of the French king, but they saw themselves as something entirely different, a sort of people that were too powerful to do homage.
Rollo had realized that the route to power called for diplomacy, including taking the king's daughter Gisella's hand in marriage. Rollo's second marriage was Christian, setting Gisela apart from his first wife Papa, whose marriage had more Danico status, a Scandinavian custom which allowed for more than one wife. In the tiny village of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo swore loyalty to the king, agreed to protect him from other Viking raiders, and promised to convert to Christianity. In return, the king offered Rollo all the land between the river Epte and the sea. The province of Normandy was born. Rollo's baptism in 912 AD was a key step on his integration into the Frankish world. And there's written evidence from just a few years later that backs this up. I'm meeting historian Pierre Baudouin.
So what's very interesting about this is that ordinarily with Viking settlements, I expect less written documentation and more archaeological evidence, but you actually have some written evidence to show us, don't you?
Yes, there is a diploma that is a royal acta of Charles the Simple with the first document who mentions Rollo and his companions. And the documents had been written in 918. So it's the first written evidence of Rollo. And so what it said, that the Abbey of La Croix-Saint-Lefroy is given to the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but this abbey had been given to the Norman of the Seine, that is Rollo, and his companions for the protection of the kingdom, pro tutela regni.
So that's amazing because it shows us that already at this point in time, Rollo is integrated to the point that the king understands him as a protector.
Rollo, the former pagan Northman, but now newly baptized, was now trusted by the king in Paris to protect great Christian sites. the Viking was fast becoming a Norman. Rollo's mass baptism marked the beginning of a complex process of Christianization for the Vikings in Normandy. To understand more about the importance of Christianity to the first leaders, I'm meeting Professor Leonie Hicks.
So I think arguably one of the most important moments in the history of the Normans is this conversion of Rollo to Christianity. But how much can we know about this really? Is this something that is entirely pragmatic and political, or is this something that is genuinely spiritual?
The short answer is we can't be certain that it's something that he's doing out of faith. So one of the ways in which Vikings, Northmen, whatever we want to call them, are made acceptable is to suggest, well, we will, yes, give you some land, but we want something in return, which is for you to convert. So that's, if you like, the diplomatic, political aspect of conversion. But what we do know is that after Rollo was baptized, following the Treaty of Saint-Clair-Sept, he did make donations to the major Norman abbeys. And we also have indications that towards the end of his life, or during his life, he ransomed captives who were Christians. Rather, one of the chroniclers says, I don't know, Shaban says, before he would have beheaded them.
Okay.
But now he ransomed them or set them free because that was the right thing to do. But what we can say is that certainly the dukes, or the Counts of Rouen, as we should call him in this early stage, did take on the board that being a Christian was something you should at least seen to be and seen to be doing the right things. And I think we need to think of this as a process. So he might be, well, I think this is a good idea, so yes, I'll be baptized, and then gradually faith deepens. So it's very much a process. So the longer these people spend around churchmen and hearing sermons and so on, that the faith sort of deepens. We can never get in anybody's heads as historians. We do have a slightly different take on it. So Archbishop Guy of Rouen, Guy writes to the Archbishop of Reims and said, I've got a problem. I've got these Norsemen that are settled in the Seine Valley. This is in the first decade or so of the 10th century. They've converted. They're sort of lapsing a bit, and they're going back to some of their pagan ways. They don't really know what to do. The Pope gets involved, and the advice is be patient. So very much following the model that St. Augustine adopted when he came at the late 6th century to England. Be patient, teach them, persevere. You know, they might be genuine in some respects. These are long-seated traditions that they're not ready to give up yet. So we get these tantalizing glimpses of the process that Rollo and his descendants must have gone through to actually come to some sort of faith that was perceived as genuine by contemporaries.
Well, I think that one thing is clear here is that as much as this might be a pragmatic decision on Rollo's part to convert, it's also really pragmatic on the part of the church as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The problem is what to do with these quite violent people who have been raiding them down the river. They've got as far as Paris and Chartres. You need to come to some arrangement with them to stop the violence. And so, yes, it is pragmatic on both sides. By becoming Christian, the Normans then become less alien, less other. They become more like the Franks, and they can then start to work within that political and diplomatic sphere that the Franks are used to. It's an accepted way of bringing people into the fold, of coming to a modus vivendi with other groups of people and actually getting along.
As a band of Viking pirates became a new and settled political force, this also meant embracing a new religion. And the Normans did this as they did with everything, fiercely. If they were going to be Christians, they were going to be the biggest and best Christians you'd ever seen. And that meant doing things like expanding things here at Mont Saint-Michel. There had been churches here since the Merovingian period, but the Normans established a new monastery, where there would be monks who could pray for their souls as they engaged in warfare. But how was there even a church here for the Normans to expand on in the first place? After all, the Vikings had been raiding up and down the coastline here for centuries. Well, locals attributed the protection to the intercession of Saint Michael the Archangel, who this church is named after. Saint Michael was the leader of God's army. He was responsible for defeating Satan in the war between the angels and the rebel demons. This fierce and warlike approach to Christianity would have really appealed to the Normans, who saw themselves not just as Christians, but defenders of Christianity against the Norse pagan Vikings.
Rollo was revered for turning the Viking Northmen into Norman Christians. When he died, he was buried in Rouen Cathedral, the site of the pivotal baptism which cemented the place of the duchy in the Christian European world. A later version of his tomb is still here.
This is Rollo's tomb. He was buried here in Rouen Cathedral, the same place that he was baptized, which is a really explicit statement about his connection to the place and his conversion to Christianity. But we don't actually know when Rollo died. We know he was certainly dead by 933. This is just kind of a guess based on when he drops out of records. However, by this point, he'd already passed on power to his son, William Longsword. And William integrated really well into the line of succession. His mother was a local. He was born a Christian, so he had nothing to prove. And things passed on really smoothly. And that's really testament to what Rollo was able to achieve. His son was accepted as a ruler, and it's because he'd created something very new, a Norman dynasty.
Rollo's son, William Longsword, seems to have been a sincere Christian, and he was the first duke to take interest in the restoration of the monasteries. He expanded his border westward, and was able to give the canons of Mont Saint-Michel several estates in Auvergne. The monasteries were a kind of insurance policy, religious castles where the monks engaged in endless spiritual warfare against Satan on their behalf.
This is the oldest extant part of Mont Saint-Michel. Built in the early 10th century, and it's a wonderful example of what we call Romanesque architecture, where you get these gorgeous rounded arches. And it's a very French form of architecture, and there's no surprises there. When the Normans became local, they wanted everyone to understand that they knew what a church looked like. They were building Frankish churches because they were a new type of Frankish person. And not only did they build churches, they built the best and most beautiful versions of them. They weren't just some Vikings fresh off the boat from Norway. They knew what it meant to be a Frank.
William Longsword continued and completed the expansion of Normandy westwards, receiving Continent and Avranches from the king. Scandinavian through his father and Frankish through his mother, William had been brought up a Christian. He should have been accepted by both communities. But not everyone was happy with the growth of Norman power and lands. On the 17th of December, 942, William was assassinated by the men of Arnulf, the Count of Flanders. Marriage alliances could work in the Normans' favor, but they could also create perilous difficulties.
On the one hand, you can convert and you become in the same religious, cultural, political milieu as the people that you're living among. But if you start marrying them, you form very strong political alliances. You've got friends on your borders that you can call on. There's that expectation then that you're not going to be fighting with, say, the Duke of Aquitaine or the Duke of Brittany. William Longsword marries Leada of Vermandois. The problem comes, Arnulf Flanders is actually excluded. He sees himself as excluded from this series of marriage alliances. So instead of having a nice ally on the northeastern borders of Normandy, you end up with somebody who is outside this sort of charm circle of all the marriages that William's making. And Arnulf possibly feels left out of these connections and sees other nobles profiting in alliance with the Normans, and so this might be one of the reasons, as well as the expansionist nature of the Normans, that leads to William's murder.
And that seems to be why William Longsword met a violent end, at the behest of a jealous rival for power in northern France.
By 942, William is succeeded by his son, Richard I. But that's not really an obvious point of succession because Richard wasn't a legitimate son. He's born in a really Viking way. His mother is not actually the queen, it's a Breton concubine named Sprata. So we know that there are still kind of Viking concubines kicking about the court. But he's not Viking enough that he speaks Norse, so his father sends him away to Besson, which is near Bayeux, in order to learn Norse, make sure he understands where his roots are. Another Viking thing about Richard is that he allows a slave market to operate here in Rouen, which it continues to do up until about the year 1000. That's super odd for a Christianized people because the church is really big on saying that Christians can't enslave other Christians. However, Richard is like, well, Vikings are bringing in enslaved people from Ireland and England. It's not my fault. And he wants to make sure that he's still connected with his Viking roots. He doesn't want to make the other Norse people angry. This is a real tension that really embodies what it means to be Norman.
Despite difficult beginnings, Richard would rule Normandy for more than 50 years. He relied on the church for support and restored more church land, and established his second son, Robert II, as the Archbishop of Rouen. Peace and security again reigned in Normandy. By the time of Richard's death, aged 64 in 996, he had become known as Richard the Fearless. There was an idea of Normanness that hadn't existed before. Within 2 generations, Normandy was a consolidated duchy with a heritage and a dynastic family, not Viking nor French, but something new entirely.
Richard I is succeeded by his son, Richard II. And really, Richard II's rule is completely defined by order and stability. He's the person who makes the borders of Normandy what they still are today. And as a part of this, he makes shrewd political moves like marrying his sister off to the King of England. He also commissions Dudo of St. Quentin to write the family history, which is how we know about all of his ancestors, basically from Rollo up to him. All of these are calculated moves, and they show that the Normans are not a family of chaos and anarchy. They are one of stability and order.
The initial task of the first 4 leaders had been to expand, define, and protect Normandy's borders, which in the beginning were constantly under threat. In doing so, they created and strengthened a durable duchy. Richard II understood the importance of myth-making and cultural heritage. Like his predecessors, he was creating a dynasty through strategic marriages. But the Norman approach to marriage was much more complex than it may seem from the records.
So what we find is that often the dukes are marrying Frankish women because that's politically expedient, but they also have what some historians call concubines, or we might call mistresses or partners, but very actually quite deep long-term relationships with women of Danish or Norman Danish ancestry. For example, Gunnar would be a very good case here. So Gunnar married Richard I, and in the 12th century, Robert of Torigny, updating the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, tells us about this cloak marriage, whereby Richard and Gunnar marry each other, and the children are surrounded with a cloak. The parents and the children are surrounded with a cloak to make them legitimate. But what is very interesting is the way that Dudo, our main source for early Normandy, what he does is to show us that the children that are succeeding are all from these partnerships rather than the marriages with Frankish women. That we don't have children from these Frankish marriages recorded at all. So either they didn't have any children, or they died, or Dudo just didn't write about them. But the people inheriting and the ducal line are coming from the partnerships, the concubines, the mistresses, the partners, whatever you want to call them, which is very interesting in terms of perhaps how the Normans are perceiving themselves. So on one level, yes, we're Frankish or we're like the Franks, but actually we have our own identity too.
Gunnar was a remarkable Norman woman. She was mistress, then wife to Richard I, and functioned as regent of Normandy during the absence of her spouse.
We also have a very actually vitriolic, nasty poem about an Irish poet, Murad, by Warner of Rouen. But at the end of that, we have, as Murad tries to find his wife who's been sold into slavery and his daughter, he appears before Gunnar at court. And we see here an image of a powerful woman who has the ability to manumit slaves and to exercise some kind of power and influence and authority on her own behalf. She's incredibly long-lived, so she was a figure of great continuity, of great wisdom. We see her witnessing charters, so she's a very, very important lady.
The Northmen had realized that to make wealth and power permanent, they had to learn to run a state. Their new neighbors showed them how. They mastered French social structures, administration, and legal systems with their customary ferocious energy and ambition. And they began to speak Latin and French, mainly because they needed to play Western European religion and politics. They established castles as bases for control. This is mighty Falaise in central Normandy, where I'm meeting historian Matthias Dillies.
Oh, wow. What an incredible view. Well, here we are on the stunning walls of Falaise Castle, and can you tell me when this incredible building was founded?
Well, the whole castle was actually founded in around 960 by Normandy's third Duke, Richard the Fearless. And we have here in Falaise one of the first stone castles of Normandy.
That's a really strong kind of statement about what he means to do in his ambitions for a dynasty, because it's one thing to be a conqueror and come in and burn things down and completely antagonize the church. It's another to situate yourself as a part of the local landscape.
That's why they were so smart, because they understood very quickly that if they had just remained this colonizing force in Normandy and crushing the local population, they wouldn't get anywhere. So they have the church on their side, and they try to have the local population on their side. And so if you build a castle, that means you offer protection to the local population. And so this definitely will make you very popular.
And in that way, a castle like this is more than just a strategic position, but it's symbolic, yes?
Yeah, that's right. You mean to show that, you're actually the ruler of all of Normandy. And the paradox, again, is that the Normans were able to control all of Normandy the way the King of France hadn't been able to before the Vikings were there.
The Normans here at Falaise were part of a culture rooted in order and permanence, but they didn't completely lose touch with their Viking past. Any attempts to revolt against the new order were brutally repressed. And, as with any noble family, factional feuds were rife.
There is a lot of infighting. So one of the challenges of a duke would be to make sure that he could control quite a rowdy bunch, because they were former Vikings, so they definitely were not choir boys.
And eventually you get to this point where there are questions of succession as well, right? You can be a bit more Norman, but the way Vikings come to power could be sometimes fighting your own brother over who is going to be the ruler, yes?
And so, now family is going to be very important, the lineage. There's going to be a lot of drama, and sometimes even mysterious deaths will happen, and suddenly a brother will take over.
But one of the biggest cold cases, right? This comes to us from 1026 and kind of coalesces here, doesn't it?
So we have Robert the Magnificent, who was count of a little area next to Falaise, and there was a bit of a spat between him and his brother, Richard. Robert decided to stay in the castle, and Richard then besieged the castle here. After quite a lengthy siege, eventually Robert surrendered to Richard, and then Richard married the daughter of a king of France. That made him really very sort of officially legitimate in Normandy, and then banquet, and he dies right after the banquet. So who knows what happened? I guess we'll never know.
Richard III's brief reign from 1026 to 1027 highlighted the tension at the heart of Norman society. Normandy was a fractious place. After Richard III's mysterious death, his brother, Robert I, became Duke. He may have come to the throne through fratricide, and from this context, the most famous Norman of all was born.
There are several myths about how William's parents met, but they all involve this well below Falaise Castle. One such version says that Duke Robert spied from the castle walls the beautiful common woman Herleva here next to the well. Overcome with lust, he does what any self-respecting duke would do at the time. He sent his servants down here to ask her to come up to the castle for a little bit of off-the-books fun. Herleva said to the servants that she might be a common woman, but she was not a common hussy, and that if Robert wanted a relationship with her, she was going to enter the front gates of the castle like a lady would. The next day, she rode in resplendent on a white horse with her hair shining down, and she became Robert's official frilla, the Danish word for a concubine. Now, this might seem a little unofficial to us, but from a Norman standpoint, it was perfectly acceptable and extremely official.
When Robert and Herleva met, the course of French and English history changed. The child conceived in this meeting, William, will come to be known as the Bastard. But his origins were understood differently by contemporaries.
So now we tend to talk a lot about the fact that William is born out of wedlock. We talk about how he's called William the Bastard. But at the time, that wasn't really that unusual, was it?
No, absolutely not. Because most of the Norman aristocracy at the time was born out of wedlock. So, William the Bastard, yeah, so what? We are all bastards, essentially. That's what it means. So it wasn't really something that could be held against him. Probably what the Norman aristocracy would hold against him was that his mother was not from the aristocracy. She was probably accepted by most people at the time. The church probably frowned upon that, but the church was very flexible at the time.
Matthias reflects on the speed of the Viking transition into a Norman identity.
But we can imagine that after that generation, Norman dukes would no longer speak really Scandinavian, and that's when there's going to be really like a huge rift between Normans and Vikings. We can really fairly suppose that there was a bit of contempt between Normans and Vikings, Scandinavians. The Scandinavians would, they would actually see the Normans as former adventurers who had settled and then were farming the land, so not romantic at all. And then the Normans would actually see the Vikings as those pirates, pillagers, pagans, not worthy of respect at all. So there was really this sort of clear separation now between Norman identity and Scandinavian identity.
So on the one hand, you've gone soft, and on the other, well, you're a Viking.
Yeah, exactly. But the smart thing is that those new Normans would actually still incorporate parts of their own culture and combine it with Frankish culture. And that's how Norman culture was invented, and that's why it was so powerful. Down the generations, the Normans will end up dominating almost all of the Kingdom of France, so that's how they were successful. And of course, as they were Vikings, they would settle elsewhere, for instance, in the south of Italy and Sicily as well, and they founded a kingdom there. So if you find Normans everywhere in Europe, it's because they exported their own culture in sometimes the most unlikely of places.
So, sometimes the technology that helps you isn't just about boats. It can be a social technology as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to massively improve your standards of living, even just the law enforcement and how peaceful your own duchy is going to be. And we have to really remember that 11th century in Europe is a brutal environment. There is only one area that is fairly peaceful, that's Normandy. The Mont Saint-Michel thrived during that particular period because now peace had been established.
When Robert and Herleva met, the course of French and English history changed. The chaos surrounding his father's ascension to the throne would define William's early years.
This, then, is the context into which William was born. Normandy was a fractious place.
But the young Norman duke had powerful friends across the clergy and nobility. He had inherited a strong duchy. The Normans had combined Scandinavian seafaring ways of war and the Carolingian continental tradition of organization and strength. They had created something potent and new. Relative internal stability enabled them to turn their ferocious appetite outwards. Norman sights would soon be turning north. In the next episode, we explore William's precarious childhood and early military experience. By 1066, the Normans were hungry for more land and power. We see how William the Bastard became William the Conqueror, and what happens when the Norman ferocity confronts another culture.